440 miles to the general southwest of the Beaumont battle space. At the stroke of midnight on October the 4th, the relative peace had been completely shattered and totally stripped away as the thunderous cacophony of many thousands of pounds of ordnance crashed into defending forces in the area, as well as other key targets. Massive rumbling of many thousands of vehicles was heard for miles also in the area as they rolled across the coastal plain of South Texas. This all as they moved further and further inland. Naturally, air defense as well as fighter cover was avidly allocated to the invading external components, as well as to even the Trojan shock forces. The external invasion prong of Group Armies 15 through 20 of the PLA was certainly no exception to this case. Nearly 320,000 troops in just this one massive grouping, spearheaded by the 16th Group Army, leading the combat operations in this area, would post-border battle all fall into convoy formation. This many miles long convoy of potent invasion forces would race deep inland, moving along the general coastal areas of Texas, taking secondary state highways until reaching I-10 in Houston. I-10 would, of course, lead this particular external invasion prong through the Beaumont battle space and into the American Southeast to reinforce Trojan units within that particular invasion sector. Arriving by 6 p.m. on day one into the Beaumont area of operations, the I-10 corridor and the city itself as a key node would be totally under PLAN Marine control by that point in time, as the very powerful invasion forces, as the external invasion prongs, including the invasion prong of Group Armies 15 through 20, were now smashing their way across the borders to rapidly race deep inland to support the Trojan shock armies back in the Beaumont area of operations. The landings were now unfolding simultaneously at midnight, along with the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes, as the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, heavily supported in the air and at sea, and even with the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade, a Trojan unit in eastern Texas, firing a small number of tactical ballistic missiles into the battle space. The landings were primarily carried out by 3 different components. A single company of the Recon Battalion landing first along the north shore of the Sabine Lake to totally capture and control a marine services facility which had adequate docks to support the landing of the remains of the Reconnaissance Battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, as well as the Medium Combined Arms Battalion and Light Combined Arms Battalion in this particular area, as they would all be landed within the first 3 hours, effectively establishing a bridgehead in this area and expanding that bridgehead before conducting inland operations in a rapid tempo of operations, as well as also, in addition to the reconnaissance elements landing ashore via LCAC from the Type 75 landing dock or helicopter carrier, the combat engineers would also land in the city of Port Arthur and effectively capture that particular port in that city without having to fire a shot, as PLAN combat engineers of the Combat Engineer Battalion would effectively send ashore one of their companies in rubber motor rafts, and again seize the critical port facilities of Port Arthur without effectively having to fire a shot, enabling 5 additional battalions of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade to make landfall, with the rest of the Combat Engineer Battalion landing at the freshly captured docks in the port, as well as also the heavy Combined Arms Battalion's forces making landfall in addition to the combat engineers within the first several hours, followed up quickly by the Shorad Battalion, the Artillery Battalion of PLZ 07 122 millimeter howitzers, as well as also the Support Battalion, which would be the chief logistical force of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade operating on land, as the Services Support Company and Headquarters Companies would remain at sea for the duration of this operation. The land-based battalions would seize and or destroy all critical objectives with massive air support from a single Russian VVS Su-34 squadron, as these powerful strike aircraft, each equipped to carry 26,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions, would strike targets predominantly inland, while at sea, the PLAN vessels would also strike land targets, but also completely eradicate all American military ships in the area, chiefly the naval vessels, the Army transport ships under the U.S. Military Sealift Command, and, of course, the Coast Guard vessels aiding in patrolling the Sabine Lake and Neches River, which led to the actual port facilities in the city of Beaumont. The USS Indianapolis, a littoral combat ship pictured here, would be struck by 3 hypersonic YJ-21 anti-ship missiles, as well as a single USUN underwater loitering munition. As this was a very advanced weapon, the USUN, as there had already been surface-based loitering munitions, this loitering munition was the first of its kind and could attack submarines as well as surface vessels, and was a very powerful weapon indeed to utilize against American ships, and thus being struck by 4 different weapons, the USS Indianapolis, or USNS Indianapolis rather, would erupt in massive explosions before going to the bottom of the sea, as the Sabine Lake was effectively directly connected to the rest of the Gulf through a narrow corridor, as this inland type of harbor area could contain many civilian ships, such as cargo vessels, fishing boats, and more. And this area was now being heavily patrolled by Coast Guard and naval vessels for portions of the overall security planning. As in land, the military logistical forces within the city of Beaumont itself, as the U.S. Military Sealift Command, the 842nd Transportation Battalion, the 373rd Combat Sustainment Support Battalion, and the 596 Transport Group were chiefly logistical forces of the military that operated within the city, and the U.S. Marine presence, chiefly 2 companies from the 1st of the 123rd Marine Battalion belonging to the 4th Marine Division, which this was a reserve unit, had effectively contributed its Alpha Company, which was a rifle company, and its battalion's weapons company, which were interspersed together in a bivouac location chosen due to the very small lack of accommodations for these additional forces within the city, and thus private properties outside of the city to the north were effectively requisitioned for the use of these 2 marine companies, and they were well spread out, and the 2 companies being interspersed had dug in this area and established this bivouac site into their camp to be able to support in a security capacity the logistical military forces inside of the city, as this was part of the defense plan. The PLAN's plan involved them cutting off and destroying these security forces through the use of their air assault battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, as the Z-9WA attack helo gunships were very powerful weapons indeed, and effectively comprised the combat aviation battalion of the air assault of the combat aviation company of the air assault battalion, which would support the seizure of the landing zone to be used in the north by 2 PLAN air assault infantry Marine companies and their 82 millimeter mortar company for their land-based fire support, as the Transport Aviation Battalion, flying their high-capacity Z-18 transport/utility helicopters, could bring in 3 companies at a time, or 2 companies, and massive logistics aboard the remaining helos, and as such would bring in the first 3 companies, drop them off, and return to the Type 75 helicopter carrier or landing dock to pick up the remaining 2 air assault infantry companies and fly them in a horseshoe pattern and land them to seize the I-10 bridge as well with the last 2 ground-based air assault infantry Marine companies before returning back out to sea, flying in the horseshoe pattern to avoid the salvos of incoming cruise missiles that were now striking the many bridges that crossed the rivers, canals, and other tributaries that crisscrossed this entire sizable battle space, as this was a 45-mile east to west by 30-mile north-south area. There are many lakes, wetlands, such as marshes and swamps, as well as also, again, rivers, creeks, and canals that were all over this area, and controlling the 96 bridge of the State Highway 96, as well as the I-10 bridge, and, of course, the I-10 bridge out of the city, moving eastbound, would ensure that all American military forces would be properly trapped within the city, as well as armed civilians, including armed civilian militia-type elements that were spaced out throughout this battle space, as they were more common in this particular battle space than in some others. They would all be effectively mopped up by the advance of the Combat Engineer Battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade upon getting their entire battalion ashore, as well as the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion that would sweep to the general north and into the city, as retreating elements trying to escape across the 96 bridge would be engaged and destroyed by a combination of fire from the PLAN air assault infantry forces, including their 82 millimeter mortar company within the air assault battalion, as well as also artillery fire being laid down heavily by the time the artillery battalion will have made it ashore to support all the maneuver elements in their race to seize and or destroy various objectives throughout the battle space, as fighting inside the city would be heavy, as the military sites would come under heavy assault by PLAN Marine forces as they sought to capture the rail and port infrastructure intact while destroying the key buildings occupied by the American military forces, such as these reservists in the remains of a destroyed building, trying to effectively fight back against PLAN Marines off in the distance as fires raged over other destroyed areas. The fighting would be exceedingly heavy and savage, as would the fighting outside of and around the city, including against the U.S. Marine forces, who would be under massive assault from not just the PLAN Marine forces, but of course their Russian allies as well, dropping enormous quantities of munitions upon them from 2 out of the 12 available Su-34 strike aircraft, which would expend all of their air-to-ground munitions dug-in nature of the Marine forces before conducting their RTB to rearm, as it would take, dropping all their munitions over the wide area to destroy most of these two companies, while the PLAN Marine Air Assault Forces would conduct the mopping up operation between the heavy use of their Z-9WA gunships, their ground forces backed up by 82 millimeter mortar fires, as mortars are in various phases of exploding in this image. The ACVs, which were quite capable vehicles, as these replaced the older AAVs, which were tracked, came equipped in some cases with the very powerful 30 millimeter autocannons. Although the Marines had boasted the most capable firepower out of all the U.S. military forces on land, they would be rapidly picked apart by both the PLAN and VVS strike capabilities, as this incoming ATGM is about to hit the Marines in this trench. It would also come under heavy fire from the 23 millimeter cannon on either side of these gunships, in addition to the ATGM fire, as the gunships, some of which were equipped with 70 millimeter rocket pods, would save these for extreme emergencies, whereupon they would be required to heavily back up their ground troops, as these rockets were devastating over a relatively sizable area. They could pick apart attacking dismounted or infantry type forces with relative ease. As the landing of the first 3 air assault companies of the 6 PLAN Marine Brigades Air Assault Battalion occurred at the same time as the initial landing of the first Recon Company, as well as also the landing of the first PLAN Marine Combat Engineer Company, who again took the port of Port Arthur without firing a shot, mostly due to the confusion, panic, and pandemonium that had been created by the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes, removing all American ISR capabilities and communications capabilities, as well as that of the civilian population, causing a total grid down situation, as well as causing them to lose access to telecom, standard internet, and more, with also the use of electronic warfare assets such as this Y9LG electronic warfare / ELINT aircraft, which had electronic attack capabilities to jam radio and redundant radars, such as multi-mission radars or air defense radars, which were not hooked up to the internet or satellite in any way and thus not affected by those attacks, but were effectively generator powered. This aircraft, along with the Type 055 guided missile cruisers, the Renhai class ships out at sea, also had very powerful electronic warfare capabilities, and combined blanketed this entire battle space in electronic jamming of radio and redundant radar, causing an absolute and total loss of all capabilities to see what was going on in the battle space for the Americans, and thus come up with actionable intelligence to act upon to counter the invasion. As the PLAN forces, on the other hand, and the coalition forces more broadly, had total IT, AI, and ISR dominance, as well as firepower dominance, and they concentrated their heavy firepower in relatively small areas at the initiation of the invasion, as in the primary areas wherein the Trojan shock forces had broken out of their CCP regime properties, which were strategically purchased dangerously near their objectives, as well as also the crossing of the external forces, crossing both the southern and northern borders to act as the rapidly moving, heavy-handed reinforcements of the Trojans that were already inland and doing much of the heavy lifting of the entire campaign. As we go to the map of the north of the Sabine Lake, the first troops of the Reconnaissance Battalion to land was a single recon company comprised of the very capable Lynx all-terrain vehicles, both in the up-armored models, which were very well protected against small arms fire, as well as also the non-armored models that were effectively utilized by the headquarters platoons in each recon company. These headquarters platoons acting as logistical command and even supporting elements in terms of combat support, as they boasted heavy weapons such as the Type 77 12.7 millimeter machine guns or the QLZ-04 belt-fed 35 millimeter grenade launchers as a crew serve, very similar to the American Mark 19 in its effective capacity as a crew serve system, as the 35 millimeter grenades used by China and the 40 millimeter grenades used by America were not all that different in their destructive capabilities. These weapons were absolutely savage, while the up-armored versions of the Lynx utilized the devastating 12.7 millimeter Jiangxi Gatling machine gun, which could lay down enormously high rates of the devastating anti-materiel rounds, which were the 12.7 millimeter. These were even more devastating than the heavy machine guns utilized by the headquarters troops on their Lynx ATVs, as they would be dropped off by LCAC immediately on the coast. Their primary initial objective at first was to seize control of the Marine Services facility. If we go to the map of the area in the north of the Sabine Lake, at the immediate opening of hostilities, American ships came under immediate attack as the military vessels consisting of a Protector-class Coast Guard cutter, 2 Sentinel-class Coast Guard cutters, and 1 Heritage-class Coast Guard cutter, and also the USNS Indianapolis in this area would all be struck immediately by hypersonic anti-ship missiles fired by the Type 055 Renhai-class guided missile cruisers, which would also fire their long-range and high-altitude capable HHQ-9 air defense missiles to swat down the 2 helicopters, the 2 MH-60Rs, which were anti-submarine warfare helicopters launched from the back deck of the USNS Indianapolis, that were patrolling the area along with a Coast Guard Dolphin-class helicopter as well. These missiles, upon receiving a lock from both vessels, 2 Type 055s, which would conduct the majority of the attacks, opening up this operation in the area, with the other 2 concentrating on the Houston battle space, at least initially, with the submarines similarly divided, would launch a combination of land attack cruise missiles, air defense missiles, and anti-ship missiles at multiple targets near simultaneously, as again, the Type 055 boasted the highly advanced Dragon Eye system, as well as these vessels also having powerful electronic warfare capabilities, which meant with the Dragon Eye, they could track and target multiple different targets over various domains, including undersea targets, surface vessel targets, land targets, and air targets, and fire at multiple targets virtually simultaneously. As the helos of the Transport Aviation Company and Combat Aviation Company from the Air Assault Battalion were passing over this very area, as this was called the Rainbow Bridge over the Neches River area, they were en route to drop off their initial 3 land-based companies, 2 air assault infantry Marine companies, and 1 Marine 82mm mortar company, before again returning to pick up the last 2 air assault infantry companies to drop them off at the I-10 bridge, with follow-up flights from the Transport Aviation Company bringing in supplies to both groupings, as the Combat Aviation Company, with their potent Z9WAs, would linger in the area as long as possible until the Marine forces were destroyed, upon then returning to the Type 055 to rearm, refuel, and conduct any needed maintenance for further operations. These operations were already now moving at a very high tempo, and the airstrikes were simply gargantuan on various targets. Again, great care would be taken to preserve the rail and port infrastructure of the military facilities, as this, the Military Sealift Command and its associated sites throughout the Port of Beaumont, were a highly critical objective because these were the sites from which American military forces were deployed overseas, including from Fort Hood and Fort Polk and other areas, as train loads of heavy combat vehicles and also supporting vehicles moved through the considerable rail infrastructure in the area to be offloaded and put onto ships of the U.S. Military Sealift Command and sent abroad on deployments, as well as also returning. And this particular area was a critical objective for the PLAN 6th Marine Brigade because for the occupation of the nation, it would serve a similar purpose as coalition vehicles would be brought in by sea and also deployed throughout the nation's rail infrastructure and road infrastructure after the conquest of the nation, as well as also sent home when required. And sites like this were absolutely critical military objectives. And as it was relatively lightly guarded, as the Americans had spread their forces very thin throughout the entirety of the nation, as they expected some kind of smaller scale attack, they had no idea of the sheer scope and scale of the largest ever invasion in all of human history, as they were totally smashed already in the opening phases, with many different missile strikes coming in and hitting various targets throughout the nation, including within just this battle space, as also the 616th Strategic Missile Forces fired 4 DF-15Bs and 4 DF-11As at different building targets, especially the U.S. Military Reserve Station in the city of Beaumont, as well as also certain buildings in the port sites of the military facilities. And also another critical objective in the port area was the Exxon facilities, which were critical energy infrastructure required for colonization operations after the victory. And many of these facilities were wanted as much intact as was possible. And thus, there were many objectives in this area that were to be secured and or destroyed by the coalition forces. And as we go to the map of the northern portion of the Sabine Lake, many YJ-21 hypersonic anti-ship missiles were passing through the area to not only hit U.S. military ships, but also to not just their combat vessels, but also to hit their logistical vessels. As, again, there were also 3 Lewis and Clark naval supply ships, 3 General Frank S. Besson class Army transport ships, and of course a fleet oiler of the U.S. Navy, which was the USNS Kanawha. And all of these vessels were being targeted, as well as the Coast Guard cutters and the USNS Indianapolis. This particular vessel here was the Heritage-class vessel called the Argus, being targeted by 2 USUN undersea loitering munitions and 2 YJ-21 hypersonic anti-ship missiles. 2 HHQ-9s would destroy 1 MH-60R on its patrol over the waters at the immediate stroke of midnight with the tandem anti-sat and cyber strikes, as well as the other one being hit by 2 additional HHQ-9s at the time, as the anti-ship missiles and USUNs were now in the area hitting many targets. On this particular map of this portion of the coast of the north of the Sabine Lake, the Heritage-class cutter, the Argus, the USNS Indianapolis, the littoral combat ship, and a Protector-class Coast Guard cutter were in this immediate area up the Neches River in this particular spot, as this was the state highway of 81 that effectively was called the Rainbow Bridge. It passed over this area. There was a road that ran beneath it, leading directly into the Marine Services facility. Effectively, the Marine Services facility was a facility that dealt with marine logistics, as well as also vessel maintenance and repair, dock construction, as well as also salvage and rescue operations at sea, as well as also offshore oil and gas support operations. So the docking facilities in this area, which also included a crane, were more than adequate for the operations of landing 3 PLAN Marine battalions. As there were several docks, there was also massive fuel tanks, there was a warehouse, a workshop, and of course the office building. It has to be understood at all times, as hostilities broke out and pandemonium reigned everywhere. In this particular part of the map, there were many homes of militia-type personnel, as this was a rural area, the other side of the opening of the Neches River, and there were many militias that had effectively clicked up as a direct result of the migration crisis. And this was a phenomenon throughout many rural areas in the country by this time, and these would effectively be the first responders, at least on land, to the invasion landings of the PLAN Marines. As within the city of Port Arthur, there was effectively no shots fired, as the city's residents were in a complete and total panic, and any armed civilians in the area didn't dare to effectively fire on the quasi-elite PLAN Marine combat engineers as they came ashore. As they came ashore within rubber rafts, at least initially, they would bring the rest of their battalion ashore with all of its heavy equipment and robotics and more capabilities, as well as also aiding in the landings of the heavy combined arms battalions, assets, and troops. The artillery battalions, assets, and troops, as well as also the Shorad battalion, which consisted of the Yitian systems, as well as also the support battalion, which was the chief logistical force that would supply all of these battalions throughout their operations. As combat would be very heavy inside of the city itself, as the armed civilians and military personnel that were in the city would attempt to fight avidly against the invading forces, although they would fail and fail miserably, as the military sites themselves would come under attack, such as in this image, where PLAN Marines are bounding and covering between rail mounds and rail infrastructure and firing on U.S. military buildings where troops are taking up position to resist the invasion forces. And the portions of the city that contained sizable groupings of armed combatants would be heavily hit by strikes from Su-34 strike aircraft, guided in through the ISR-connected real-time AI battlefield data processing system that came up with pre-prepared strike packages near instantaneously, as the ISR data from the quadcopter assets at the lowest level map the battlefield in real time alongside of the high-altitude drones and satellite assets of the coalition, again mapping out each and every battle space with a high degree of precision, plotting all real-time positions of enemy assets and forces, as well as friendly assets and forces in real time, as well as coming up with calculations involving specific munitions for the safety of the troops on the ground to prevent friendly fire incidences, while also economizing firepower against enemy forces, as well as also conducting the real-time strike packages based on ISR data. And wherever concentrations of enemy forces existed vis-a-vis the coalition, they were heavily struck, not just from the air, but also by field artillery, which would emerge on the ground, as well as also cruise missiles fired from the sea, as the PLAN vessels would also be supporting this operation with massive cruise missile strikes. And container-based cruise missile systems like the Russian Kalib-Ks or the Caliber container-based systems and the Chinese YJ-18C container-based systems would begin to fire their first initial salvos at pre-designated targets at the stroke of 2 p.m., 2 hours into the invasion. And as targeting data would change, as some targets would change throughout the different volleys and salvos to be fired by specific container systems, this targeting information could be updated directly through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, linking into these systems and changing targets in real time as necessary, if necessary. All of this firepower would be simply immense, as the reconnaissance forces of one PLAN Marine company now landing on the north shore of the Sabine Lake, as they immediately came in by the 3 LCACs that were effectively a portion of the Type 075 helicopter carrier or landing docks assets would be enough in capacity, these Type 724A LCACs, to land an entire company on the shore at one time, with the rest of the battalion's companies aboard a cargo ship that was effectively designed to be disguised as a ordinary civilian cargo ship that could pull in and unload their forces using standard docks or other types of facilities that effectively could accommodate these vessels, as the 2 additional cargo vessels would pull in behind the initial offloading of the rest of the recon battalion once the Marine Services facility was fully captured and cleared of enemy combatants. The medium combined arms battalion and light combined arms battalion would be offloaded and in that order behind the rest of the recon battalion, which upon having its whole battalion ashore would spread out and widen their bridgehead. But for the time being, a single company would land to capture the first objective, which was the Marine Services facility, which was critical to the landing of the rest of their own battalion, as well as 2 additional battalions, as the medium and light combined arms battalion would follow up the landings of the rest of the reconnaissance battalion. For the time being, as missiles flew in, the LCACs, coming in at a high rate of speed, were about to drop off the 4 platoons of the first company of the Recon Marine Battalion operating in this area, as the headquarters platoon, which again was a command and logistical element, but also a combat support element, as they were capable of moving logistics to the combat platoons of the Recon Company under fire, as they were relatively well equipped with crew-served weapons that were devastating. They and a combat platoon of the company would clear the Marine Services facility, while the other 2 combat platoons of the company would, upon defeating enemy forces, capture the road to seize control of the entry and exit points to this facility. This facility was effectively on a peninsula, and it would be easy to control the entry and exit to it upon this road. But initially, as the anti-ship missiles came in and the U-Suns came in from underwater, they effectively avoided all the civilian ships in the area, as there were cargo ships, fuel ships, fishing vessels, even yachts in the area that would be avoided by the strikes coming in from the sea, from the Type 039A Yuan class subs, as well as also the Type 055 guided missile cruisers, the Renhai class. The anti-ship missiles, hypersonics, would slam into the USNS Indianapolis and blast it into multiple pieces with a U-Sun undersea loitering munition, sending the remnants and crew to the bottom of the ocean, as well as also the helicopters being knocked out of the sky by the long-range HHQ-9 air defense missiles, including also the Dolphin helicopter patrolling the area as well. All of this happening virtually instantaneously, as the first missiles were already airborne at the immediate stroke of midnight and headed fast for their targets. There were also land attack cruise missiles fired as well, which included, at least in just this particular area, 4 YJ-18As which were supersonic cruise missiles, not subsonic, but they weren't hypersonic as either, but they were supersonic cruise missiles that were moving through the area to hit specific bridge crossings out of the city of Beaumont to effectively control entry and exit to the city, as the air assault forces would capture the main bridges that were to be left standing, as the anti-ship missiles slammed into their targets, as well as the U-Suns, destroying the Argus, a Heritage-class Coast Guard cutter. These Coast Guard cutters, had they had any access to their satellite or also internet capabilities, as well as also their electronics functioning properly, as their radio and radar systems were now totally jammed and they couldn't effectively target anything, and they were mostly dead in the water, as their computer systems were also having massive troubles and they couldn't properly navigate, having had lost satellite, as well as also the ability to use ISR assets to target their weapon systems. They were dead in the water, proverbially speaking, and easy to destroy with the tandem anti-sat cyber strikes and electronic warfare assets all working in tandem to cause this massive denigration of capabilities, effectively throwing the Americans back into the Stone Age, while China and the coalition forces were ultra-modern, as the Heritage-class Coast Guard cutter, the Argus, was effectively equipped similarly in some ways to the USNS Indianapolis, in that it had a 57 millimeter cannon. It had a 25 millimeter cannon with a 7.62 NATO coax, or effectively a 7.62 by 51 millimeter coaxial weapon, and they had 6 total 50 cal heavy machine guns aboard. But none of this would effectively cause any difference in the outcome of the operation, as they were targeted for destruction instantaneously, as the Argus would be hit by 2 YJ-21 hypersonic anti-ship missiles and 2 U-Sun undersea loitering munitions at the opening of the hostilities. There would also be the destruction of a Protector-class Coast Guard cutter equipped with a 25 millimeter cannon, as well as several 50 cals, and the destruction of the main ship or vessel in the area in terms of capabilities, the USNS Indianapolis, as this vessel, again, was also equipped with a 57 millimeter cannon, similar to the Argus, the Coast Guard Heritage-class cutter, but also had 4 equipped 30 millimeter auto cannons, as well as this vessel could be equipped with such, and it was, as they also had their 21 total rolling airframe missiles, or their RIM 116s, which effectively were their SHORAD air defense systems that were aboard this vessel, the Indianapolis, but the Coast Guard was not equipped with such. And they had Mark 50 torpedoes, and they had 2 50 cal machine guns as well, as this is a very heavily armed ship, this littoral combat ship. It was the highest priority ship that was targeted by the PLAN and was destroyed instantaneously, along with the Coast Guard vessels and the deployed 2 helicopters from its back deck, the 2 MH-60R anti-submarine warfare helicopters on patrol in the Sabine Lake. And as all these vessels were taken out of the fight instantaneously, the high tempo of operations had dictated that the LCACs immediately enter the Sabine Lake from the Typo 75 just outside of the Sabine Lake and off the immediate coast of the area, and enter the Sabine Lake rapidly, as these Type 724As had a very high speed capability, and drop off their troops as the U-Suns and missiles were effectively striking their targets. These vessels immediately entered the area to drop their forces off rapidly, as missiles continued to fly and enter the area in terms of land attack cruise missiles like YJ-18s, both the submarine-fired, the B version, and the Renhai-fired version, the A version, as well as also long-range cruise missiles in some cases, hitting targets much further inland, such as the CJ-10 cruise missiles, although these were effectively not fired in force until they were brought aboard from the Type 903 supply ship that was supplying the missiles and other logistical capabilities like fuel to the PLAN Renhai class vessels and Yuan class subs. As these missiles would be fired later and further inland, the primary missiles being used in the land attack role would be the YJ-18 series missiles. And now they were effectively hitting many bridges and even other targets located all throughout the battle space, as the PLAN cargo vessels, which would remain disguised as civilian cargo vessels even after the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes, to allow their landing to be easily facilitated and effectively go unnoticed until the last moment. These American elements entering the area from their homes, many parking vehicles just off the battle space, as this was a 1.5 by 1 mile area. Some had parked their vehicles further up and off the battle space and had entered the area on foot, moving through these woodlands and fields, and in some cases wetlands that are just off the map in some areas, into the battle space, including these personnel trying to cross the State Highway 81, while others on the highway would be hit by the total of 3 single tube fired CH-901A loitering munitions, as the PLAN forces did not have the 48 tube TEL based system to fire 48 at a time like the PLA ground forces or Army had. They did have recon troops trained to fire the single tube version, and each combat platoon of the recon company now landing ashore had one soldier trained to fire and operate these loitering munitions, or they could be set on AI target seeking mode, like when 48 at a time were fired from the TEL-like version. And as they landed and gained control of the area, they immediately clashed with foot and technical or vehicle-based armed reactionary civilians entering the area, as many had remained in their vehicles and would spread out through the area and begin to even dismount some of their forces, as each technical, like so, could carry between, depending on the cab size, could carry up to 7 to even 10 total personnel between the bed and the cab. And as these effectively constituted squads in military terms, these squad-like elements of these militia-type personnel, as again, they had clicked up due to past developments, and these past developments, in terms of the migration issue, had contributed to the coalition's buildup of their Trojan shock forces upon CCP regime properties in the nation all throughout. And these forces had effectively clicked up to be a mutual defense force against the criminal elements that were now all over the nation, but the military and paramilitary elements were quietly on CCP regime properties waiting for the signal to invade, as they were very different from the criminal elements that entered the nation. Many were also even visa holders, such as the PLA and paramilitary students who were here on student visas, as they had to have PLA or paramilitary training to even get an exit visa to leave China. Many of them were still in the service and were actually fully functional Trojan shock troops and partook in this invasion. And the armed civilians effectively were reactionary in that they were now reacting to the massive explosions and the loss of the grid and the internet and telecom and more. And now we're racing towards the coast as they saw missiles literally flying over their respective neighborhoods or homes, as this was a ruralized area and where homes were a bit more spread out. They all effectively came together, entered their vehicles, and entered the area. Some that were on the highway would be hit by these loitering munitions, as there were 3 of them total between the 3 total combat platoons that would be fired by their specialized combat drone operator in the squad, in the platoon. And these would hit with fragmentation ammunition a total of 3 technicals entering the area from across this so-called Rainbow Bridge and from also this direction, as by the time they were in this position, these forces were beginning to cross the highway as a loitering munition, one of the 3 fired from the now shore landing troops, would strike these 2 vehicles that were riding close together, and this one literally getting across the bridge but not making it any further, being hit by a loitering munition strike. as the other loitering munition that remained would patrol the area looking for targets of opportunity. As these 4 platoons landed, including the headquarters platoon element with both their Type 77 heavy 12.7 millimeter machine gunner as a crew serve weapon with their machine gunner, and some having the QLZ-04 belt-fed grenade launchers, they could lay down a heavy wave of fire with other troops logistically supporting the combat platoons in the company, as the command elements were also in these Lynx ATVs, the non-covered versions. Even they would partake in some of the fighting, as these recon troops were, just like the rest of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, quasi-elite troops, and they were not afraid to get their proverbial hands dirty, and that was even true of the company-level NCOs and officers of these companies within the recon battalion. Same went with the air assault troops. And they would end up in a heavy battle as they landed to capture this very critical objective, which was the Marine Services facility on the north shore of the Sabine Lake, as it would be critical to the offloading of the heavier forces of the Medium Combined Arms Battalion, as well as also the Light Combined Arms Battalions and the rest of the Recon Battalion that would effectively seize or destroy critical objectives on the general eastern side of the battle space of this primary landing area. And as the recon troops hit the shore out of their LCACs, the LCACs would now vacate the area as they laid down heavy fire with their Jiangxi 12.7 millimeter Gatling machine guns, which were, again, having a higher rate of fire and even more devastating than the Type 77 12.7 millimeter machine guns, as the higher rate of fire meant that more continuous torrents of lead could be effectively spit out against enemy forces at a higher rate than even the heavy machine guns could deliver. But the headquarters platoon did have some QLZ-04 belt-fed 35 millimeter grenade launchers, which could also lay down massive fire. And as these foot-based elements, a total of 55, as the total attacking force, including those that had initially made it to this area before the landings had even fully occurred, as a total of 70 had made it into the Marine Services facility and would have to be cleared from it, the total force of armed militia-type personnel was 400, as many were aboard these 18 total vehicles. So this grouping would be 10 vehicles pulling off into this area. This group would be another 8 trying to dismount all of their personnel to attack on foot with these other foot-based personnel that had come all the way down initially on foot as they had left their vehicles outside of this area. They, moving through these wooded areas, this grouping of 55 was the initial group to meet the landing Marines on the shore, would lay down small arms fire, while the PLAN Marines also returned fire with small arms, but also with belt-fed 35 millimeter grenade fire from their QLZ-04s, 12.7 millimeter fire from their crew serve weapons aboard the headquarters platoon, as well as the QLZ-04s, with the combat platoons, all 3, laying down enormous 12.7 millimeter fire that almost chopped entire trees down at the rate that these were being delivered against the attacking forces. There was also rocket-propelled grenade fire as the PLAN Marines, with their Lynx ATVs stocked with ammunition, were firing mostly anti-personnel Type 69 RPG ammunition at the attackers, as well as also some of the troops that had the 35 millimeter grenade tubes under the rifles were firing those as well. And there was also some general purpose machine gun fire in the form of 7.62 by 54 millimeter, but the heavy Gatling machine gun, the 12.7 millimeter Jiangxi Gatling machine gun, delivered the most death and destruction against these attacking forces meeting the PLAN Marines at the coast. As all of this firepower was mutually supporting between these 2 combat platoons, the headquarters platoon here and the other combat platoon, they laid down massive fires. This grouping of 55 tried to outflank them, but would fail miserably as the concentration of fire was simply too strong. At the same time, 8 vehicles that had pulled off here were trying to move through the area to disembark their troops, but they would be struck by an incoming YJ-18A cruise missile that was fired in support of this landing, which would strike and annihilate these forces, leaving a small crater in the area, even destroying all their vehicles alongside the fire that was now being vectored at them as they entered the area, because it has to be understood that all the quadcopter assets of each and every single squad within each platoon, within this whole company, was now running circuits and mapping this whole battlefield in real time. And they were assisted by this WZ-7 orbiting this exact area, as well as satellite, all interlocking to map the area in real time and aid massively in acquiring the most accurate targeting data possible. Even as the air assault forces had earlier flown through the area, the landings had occurred near instantaneously as well on the shore, and a Russian Su-34 would conduct a close air support airstrike in support of the landing PLAN Marines, initially dropping 8,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions in the form of 8 1,000-pound bombs, as well as 2 cluster munitions, before dropping another 8,000 pounds worth of air-to-ground munitions on the 10 technicals that had parked and started disembarking their forces as the PLAN Marines came ashore, and also contributed by laying down massive fire against the armed reactionary civilian forces, all after the entirety of the American military vessels and even their accompanying helicopters were completely destroyed. This battle was a high-intensity operation in terms of the sheer volume of fire being delivered, not just from the coalition forces, but even the 400 attacking armed reactionary civilians now concentrated in this small peninsula, trying to vie for control with the landing PLAN Marine troops of the Recon Battalion, as the first company to land was wiping out their opposition, as these 55 were destroyed near instantaneously as they met them at their LZ, while they then returned fire against these technicals at the same time. A cruise missile was fired at these forces from a Type 055 Ren High-class vessel in support of these forces landing, as the ISR data collected put together the strike package through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which guided this strike exactly into these forces as they were being lit up by the PLAN Marines, who also vectored fire in this direction, as all their fire was guided by the quadcopter assets. And the troops in this grouping even vectored fire into the Marine Services and Support Facility, as these technicals had all been parked with their forces disembarked out of them, with even 50 now in the office. The destruction of these forces through this massive Su-34 strike would annihilate this grouping of 70 personnel running through this area, along with this grouping of 20 personnel and this grouping of 10 technicals now disembarking some of their squad-sized elements that were exchanging fire with this combat company and the headquarters company vectoring fire in this direction after defeating these forces, and these 2 combat companies about to seize and secure the road after this punishing airstrike from the Su-34 had come in and not just annihilated these forces with a spread of cluster munitions and 8,000-pound munitions, which were highly accurate due to the SVP-24 computerized bombing site, but also the strike data put together through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, and smashed these forces, as well as these forces coming across the highway, linking up with those disembarking from their technicals and trying to lay down fire from them against the landed Marine forces, who were also returning heavy fire, as the PLAN Recon Marines were now about to clear the remaining American militia personnel from the inside of the Marine Services facility. The headquarters platoon and 1 combat platoon now prepared to roll in through the gate to the facility, and were first laying down heavy fire against these forces in the parking areas by the workshop and the office building, destroying their technicals, riddling them with heavy machine gun fire and 35 millimeter grenade fire, even some rocket propelled grenade fire, destroying all of this, leaving only smoking hulks of metal in the form of the parked vehicles, with scattered human remains throughout the parking area as the massive blasts had completely cleared this area before they then pulled in order, with the combat platoon going first, followed by the headquarters platoon, moving their way into the facility. As these personnel ran across trying to enter the warehouse, they were completely and totally annihilated by the lead Lynx of the combat platoon firing its heavy 12.7 millimeter Jiangxi Gatling machine gun at them, completely shredding up their technical and these personnel as they tried to move into the building. Now disembarking the headquarters platoon and the combat platoon elements, the combat platoon would clear this building containing 50 armed civilian personnel as they would conduct building clearance procedures, moving tactically through the hallways and clearing room by room. These personnel, and some of which who had attempted to fire out of windows, received massive return fire from the Lynx ATV gunners of the headquarters platoon, as well as also the fire coming from the 12.7 millimeter Jiangxi Gatling gun, which was absolutely devastating as it shredded through the walls, as these were anti-material rounds and could shred through certain building materials, and wiped out the personnel inside these buildings. And the troops disembarking in both platoons, the headquarters platoon would clear the workshop and the warehouse, as there were no personnel inside of these areas, while the combat forces would clear the 50 armed reactionary civilians inside of the office, while the workshop and the warehouse were also cleared. 2 squads from each platoon, one from the combat platoon and one from the headquarters platoon, would guard the dock facilities in this parking area by the docks for allowing the incoming remaining companies of the recon battalion to begin to offload their vehicles and leave the facility to begin in their company-sized forces to create a bridgehead, allowing for the next battalion to come in and offload its vehicles, which would be the medium combined arms battalion with its ZBDO 5, both in the infantry fighting vehicle versions, and they had one company of the light tank / assault gun versions, and these would be offloaded along with their mortar company in each combined arms battalion, both within the medium and light, and also the heavy, and their combat engineer company in each combined arms battalion, medium, light, and heavy. These forces would all be offloaded onto the docks, with the light combined arms battalion being last after the recon and medium combined arms battalion. The light combined arms battalion did have IFV versions of the ZBDO-5, but also had the machine gun turret versions as well, as these were much lighter forces than the medium and heavy combined arms battalion, as these forces were a bit heavier than were the Marine recon forces, but they did not pack the same amount of firepower as the medium or heavy combined arms battalions, which were the strongest of the maneuver battalions. The artillery battalion, the combat engineer battalion, and the SHORAD battalion, and the support battalion, as well as also the artillery battalion, would all be offloaded on the other banks of the Sabine Lake towards the west, as they were landing in Port Arthur, to the general southwest in the port area of Port Arthur, away from the north shore of the Sabine Lake. As these forces would land, they would establish a bridgehead before then pushing into the city of Beaumont, where heavy combat would ensue and would even last throughout most of the first day, as armed reactionary civilians would try to conduct counterattacks against the PLAN Marine forces that would be operating within the city and seizing control of the critical port facilities and military sites along the port. as the fighting in this area in the north shore of the Sabine Lake with the 1st Marine Recon Company of the Marine Recon Battalion of PLAN 6th Marine Brigade landing ashore would last, in terms of the actual combat against the armed civilians, approximately 30 minutes. Most of the short duration of the combat was a combination not only of their own very powerful weaponry, but also the massive air power support they received from their VVS Russian allies of a single Su-34 from the Su-34 squadron allocated to this particular battle space, as well as also cruise missile support from out at sea, as a single YJ-18A destroyed effectively the majority of these 8 technicals filled with armed personnel before they could all disembark, while many of them were already beginning to be engaged and shredded up by the heavy firepower of the Lynx armored ATVs with their Jiangxi 12.7mm Gatling machine guns, and also even the headquarters platoon capable of firing 35mm belt-fed grenades from their QLZ-04 systems. Firepower was devastating. Even the dismounts, of course, had potent firepower in the form of HJ-08 man portable ATGMs as well as Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades. But the ATGMs would be saved for heavier targets. As the Marine Services Facility, the first chief objective, which was a critical objective for the landing of their battalions, was taken within a short time and cleared, as they cleared the office building of of enemy personnel while securing the road with their other 2 combat platoons. The landing operations would begin virtually immediately thereafter, with the recon battalion, as it was a very light battalion, being relatively fast to offload compared to the heavier units, which would take a bit more time, as the entirety of the recon battalion, apart from the first landed company from LCAX, would all be landed within 1 hour's time, as this operation was 30 minutes to secure this particular area, and the heavy air power and cruise missile strike support effectively won the day in terms of this one operation, as the air assault operations to seize control of absolutely critical bridges, as I-10 itself was a massively important objective for the movement of the external invasion prong of Group Armies 15 through 20 minus Group Army 15, which would effectively be shed off in Houston to replace the 83rd Group Army, relieving it to move into the northeast of the state of Texas. The remaining 5 group armies would pass through this key node of Beaumont with its critical port facilities and energy infrastructure and pass into the southeast through the city of Orange, which was a state line border city and was effectively the gateway to the southeast. Upon crossing the Sabine River, the external invasion forces would be in the southeastern invasion sector to support Trojan shock armies in that area. And all of the operations being carried out now with the landings of the heavier portions of the brigade would facilitate the capture and or destruction of all the key objectives within this battle space, and all well within the first day. Although again, this would actually end up being a 2-day battle, as the remaining combat elements of the U.S. Marine Corps, as well as armed reactionary civilians, having had linked up in the wetlands, the swamps, and forests of the general north of the battle space, these forces would have to be rooted out through the use of the air assault battalion's assets, as they would hunt down the remaining 50 U.S. Marines, along with the 500 armed reactionary civilians that they would effectively be trying to partner with to carry out partisan or insurgent-like operations against their new, soon-to-be occupiers, invaders turned occupiers. And the combat would be absolutely savage. Despite the generally smaller number of forces, this mattered little, as the 8,500 PLAN Marines of the 6th Brigade were heavily supported in the air and at sea and even on land by other coalition forces that were assisting by contributing enormous firepower capabilities to the already highly capable 6th Marine Brigade, which itself was a quasi-elite, self-contained fighting unit with a myriad of capabilities in terms of its lighter units, its highly mobile units, such as its recon and air assault forces, its combat engineer sapper forces, as well as its artillery and its maneuver battalions, its light, medium, and heavy, as well as also its SHORAD battalion. All of these forces, backed up by the support battalion, which was a very capable logistical unit within the 6th PLA Marine Brigade, would rapidly seize their objectives within this battle space, as the landing was highly successful with the destruction of key American military vessels, as well as also the destruction of almost 2 entire U.S. Marine companies, which were the heaviest and best equipped defending forces in the area. The remaining forces that would be met would mostly be U.S. Army and Navy logistical forces operating within the city itself. And these American Army forces were non-combat forces, but would put up the best possible fight that they could, as on day 2, the remainder of the U.S. Marines would be viciously hunted down with their armed reactionary civilian counterparts in the northwest of the battle space. By the 3rd hour, all 3 battalions on the north shore of the Sabine Lake will have been landed, with the Combat Engineer Battalion and Heavy Combined Arms Battalion by then having been landed fully, with the remaining battalions being landed within the next 2 hours. By hour 5, all the forces will have established a massive bridgehead in the Port Arthur city and would begin to push out into the north to clear their chief objectives, which were mostly within the city of Beaumont itself, as there were other important objectives that were outside of Beaumont, such as seizing control of the entirety of I-10 throughout this battle space, as well as the Entergy Sabine power plant offices and the plant itself. The airports would also become forward operating bases for the 6 PLA Marine Brigade's land-based forces upon first having had succeeded in cleaning their battle space, cleansing it, pacifying it of all resisting forces, and seizing control of all objectives and destroying certain others. As the road bridges over most of the canals and tributaries would be largely destroyed, trapping American forces inside of Beaumont, which would prevent them from escape, as their only escape routes would be occupied by air assault troops, at least initially on day 1. This would allow for the sweep into the city of Beaumont, as the Recon Battalion would send its first company out of its battalion to occupy the bridge crossing in great haste upon first having had conducted flank clearance operations rapidly before moving into the Vidor area to ensure that there could be no escapes to the east by the forces now trapped in the city, as there would be a few thousand armed reactionary civilians inside of the city, and there would be thousands more outside, as well as the sizable contingent of U.S. military personnel remaining. These forces would be cleared out by the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, as well as the Combat Engineer Battalion, pushing their way into the city. The combat engineers deploying high levels of technology in terms of their weaponry to annihilate all of their opposition. In the next video installation within this series of a hypothetical 4th generation warfare invasion of America, utilizing a Sino-Russian coalition, the I-10 bridge would be seized immediately upon first having had dropped off the first 3 out of the total of 5 land-based companies of the Air Assault Battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade at the 96 bridge crossing area landing zone. The I-10 bridge would be seized shortly thereafter as air assault troops would be flown in to landing zones by the bridge in the form of 2 air assault Marine infantry companies and would hold the bridge even against disjointed, broken up counterattacks launched by armed reactionary civilians. They would again have the full support of the air power operating over the battle space, including even in an emergency situation, having one of their J-10 fighters out of the 2 J-10 fighter squadrons allocated to the battle space, dropping their 2 1,000-pound laser-guided precision munitions in support of the air assault troops on the ground holding their positions against counterattacks by armed reactionary civilian forces. As by this time, the 2 J-10 fighter squadrons were, again, still mostly concerned with their air superiority operations, conducting their combat air patrols over the battle space. Although, again, in emergencies, they could be called upon to drop their limited numbers of air-to-ground munitions, as the Su-34s at this time were exceedingly busy carrying out their own strike operations against targets throughout the battle space to facilitate the bringing ashore of the PLAN Marine forces. The more PLAN forces arriving ashore, the heavier the firepower would become throughout the course of the operation. More to come in the next video.